With Labor Day weekend being such a big weekend for tournaments in Warmachine, I thought it was worth giving another pass at what that meta looked like with a little bit deeper analysis. My name's Ryan, and I used to be good at Warmachine. Welcome to the Spell Rack. Labor Day weekend was probably the single biggest tournament weekend that we've had this year. And I know I already did a video to cover that meta a little bit, but I thought we could take a deeper dive into the weekend. The weekend had 4 large events. And so what I've done here is I've compiled who finished top 8, top 3, and who ended up winning the events. And so these are just those big 4 events last weekend. What I have next to this here is just a little bit of context over the meta, kind of maybe more in general. And this is game data over the last 3 months. And so you can see how many games have been played and what the average win rates are for the factions. So let's just start at the top here and talk about Infernals and kind of see what information we can glean from all of this. Infernals have 151 games played. By far, they are the lowest games played in this list. Their win rate is the highest. Now, the games played in the win rate, I mean, they're sure they're related, but I don't think there's anything statistically interesting there. What is interesting, though, is that they had 5 top 8 finishes, 1 top 3, and 1 winner. No faction won more than 1 event. Of the top 3s, there were some 2s, but 1 certainly puts you kind of in the median. And then 5 top 8 finishes was second only to Cryx. Okay, so if you have a faction that has 5 top 8 finishes, a third, and a winner, you would expect them to be one of the more largely played factions, right? If a lot of players show up and are playing an army, some people do well and some people do poorly. But here, what we're seeing is there's not that many Infernals players, and they are all doing well. Obviously not all, but disproportionately doing well. I do think there's some additional information to gather from this, and I'm going to come back to that towards the end of the video. Next, we have Old Umbri. Old Umbri clearly has a very high win rate. They've come out of the gates really strong, but they're still a brand new army. They didn't have any top 8 finishes. I think that's quite okay. People out there learning right now. Cryx, we all know, is kind of probably the boogeyman right now. Cryx did have a very good weekend. I mean, the last 3 months, they have almost the highest play rate among any faction and have a quite impressive win rate. And they got 6 top 8s. 6 top 8s is the most here. Nobody was able to convert that to a top 3 or a top spot, but they still performed incredibly well. Bloodborne Marauders, Trolls, another kind of very good high to mid-level faction, 2 top 8s with a top 3. It feels like it was a good weekend for Trolls for me. I'm frankly a little surprised that they're at the 54 win percentage here, but I think their tournament performance maybe is even a little lackluster versus their win percentage. So what can we take away from there? You have a faction that's being played pretty frequently, and you're going to have some outliers or some outstanding players at any event you go to. And here that seems to be the case with Bloodbrine, right? Storm Legion and let's do Shadow Flame kind of at the same time. These guys feel as kind of as average as you get, or maybe as expected as you get. Very strong win rates and very strong tournament performances, right? 4 top 8s, 2 translated to the top 3, and Shadow Flame ended up picking up one of the events. Given how many games are played, this probably feels okay. Although if you want to think about the games played and the win percentages, and you look at the weekend, with that many more Shadow Flame players, maybe you would have expected them to have overperformed Storm Legion, whereas Storm Legion was able to pick up the same number of top 8s and top 2s. Gravediggers, kind of in the same boat here as Storm Legion and Shadow Flame. Good representation over the last 3 months. It's part of why I've done this last 3-month spread, is because it helps get the Gravediggers faction in the meta mix. And they had a good tournament performance. Looking at their win percentage, did they overperform slightly? Maybe, maybe not. Obviously, it's certainly within a realm of reason. Obviously, Gravediggers players are starting to kind of figure out how the faction has to work. And this is something, keep Gravediggers on your radar when you're making your tournament list. The next one here is Dusk with House Callus. This is a very interesting result. Outside of Old Umbri with only 184 games, Dusk has over 350 games, and Dusk did not make a single top 8 in this list. 48% win rate, they're right next to Gravediggers, so should we have expected a performance somewhat similar to Gravediggers? Maybe. And so what does this say about the Dusk faction? I don't know. Maybe a few people that were the champions of the faction have stepped away, but there's still a very high play rate. I mean, the play rate of 355 here, very similar to Orgoth, very similar to Trolls, and the performance is just very, very different. So very clearly there's something going on with Dusk here. Orgoth, Sea Raiders, actually were almost in the same exact position as Dusk, except one player took the whole tournament home, and that was a very bright spot. So what can we take away from here? Obviously, somebody had a very incredible weekend and really broke the meta with this performance. This win, above all, I think should be applauded and appreciated. You have one of the lower win rate factions with less representation, and to have taken a top spot is really great. Khador, again, seems to be maybe kind of one of the outliers. Khador, unfortunately, is the bottom of our newer factions at a 45% win rate. Again, still play rates that are reasonable, so reasonable data sizes. They did get 3 top 8s, and they got 2 folks into the top 3. When you look at a 45% win rate, I think they did a pretty darn good job given the win rate. Obviously, Khador is another one of these factions that needs some help. Lastly, here we have the legacy factions, although these are the prime versions of the factions, 4 top 8s and a top 3. I didn't count the number of games played. It was just too much to tally. The numbers aren't too big. It's just that there's a lot of them to gather. Obviously, here, these factions are still showing up, certainly not in the significance in the numbers of the other factions. If you're a player that's looking to go to a tournament and you're doing some studying before you get there, you definitely focus on the major factions, hope to dodge one of these guys, or just kind of figure out the matchup on the fly. Another data point that I think is worth looking at is, inside of Warmachine, we have win rates. And the highest win rate here is at a 58. The lowest win rate is down here at a 45. That seems reasonable to me. I would imagine that Steamforge is probably trying to keep its top end factions no higher than, say, 55. And I would imagine they're trying to keep their lower end factions no lower than 45. I don't know for a fact, but it seems like a good spot to be in. The difference with Warmachine as opposed to other games is we don't just have faction win rates, but we have caster win rates. And so here I've taken the win rate of the highest caster in each of the factions. So Infernals, we have 62, Umbre 66. And so you can see a lot of casters into the mid 60s here and really going all the way down even through everybody except for Wintercore. Obviously, Khador is lacking this sort of top end caster that kind of carries the faction. Orgoth here obviously is Horusk. Having a 65 in Storm Legion and a 64 in Shadowflame. These are just numbers that are really anchoring the faction. You'd have to wonder if Wintercore had one caster that was at a 58 win percentage, maybe that bumps Wintercore up to a 50% win rate. So what does that really tell us? Well, maybe Wintercore, maybe Khador's not a bad faction. Maybe they don't have a good caster as a standout. Another way to say that in the reverse is maybe all these other casters need to come down a notch, which will bring their win rates down and will bring more parity. The other side to look at here is the minimum win rates. So here, Infernals, their bottom casters are 42. Some of these top factions, God, look at Cryx. Cryx has a 48%. Their worst caster is a 48% win rate. And then as you come down here, these numbers get pretty staggeringly bad, right? So now if your goal is 55 at the top, 45 at the bottom, you've got some really, really rough numbers down here. We'll go back to picking on Khador. Your best caster's a 52, your worst caster's a 22% win rate. Orgoth is 24, Dusk is 32, Gravedigger's 33. I mean, these win rates are so atrocious. Now, granted, the games played on these casters are going to be minimal. These are the casters that people don't like because they're bad. And so from a balance perspective, one of the questions I think it's worth asking is, what happens if you bring up let's use Dusk here for an example. What happens if you bring up this 32 caster to a 40% win rate or a 45% win rate? That might normalize this 48% number up to 50. And so it's a very interesting way to consider the way the game has two very separate components, right? There's the armies and then there's the casters, and both need to be carefully balanced. This last item I've given you is just a spread statistic. It's just the difference between the max and the min. And I think this is also kind of very quickly telling data. These top factions, you can see how tight their win rates are, only about 15 to 20 points between them. And then when you look at these worse factions, especially Storm Legion, 35 percent difference between your highest win rate and your lowest. And then same thing for Orgoth, 59 down to 24. And so these bottom factions really show you, rather down here, these factions really show you that some of these bottom end casters need to get brought up, and that could normalize out some of these win percentages. I don't know how Steam Forged does their balancing. Obviously, there's going to be casters that are good and bad, and units that are going to be good and bad. A table like this just shows us that there's many ways to skin a cat, and there's a lot of different interesting ways to look at this data to see where your faction falls and what the meta looks like.